Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to today's Graeco-Aegyptiaca lecture. We are actually in the fifth year, as we just discussed with Asja, of this series, which is organized jointly by UCL's Department of Greek and Latin and the Palladian, which is a small civil association based in Budapest. For the past 4 years, we've been coming together throughout the academic year monthly to discuss the various ways that the Greek-Roman world and Egypt were interconnected in the ancient world. Recordings of most of our events are available on the Palladian website and our YouTube channel. So if you happen to miss one of the lectures, you can check if they are available online. I must confess that we've fallen a bit behind with publishing the videos lately, for which I'm really sorry, but we will get there eventually. So if you'd like to stay informed about upcoming events, please subscribe to our mailing list or the Eventbrite feed. And I'm really happy to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Asja Müller. Asja studied both Egyptology and classical archaeology at the University of Leipzig and is currently professor of classical archaeology at the University of Kiel. She completed her habilitation there last year on the subject of the sanctuaries of Asclepius, but her talk today will go back to the topic she explored in her doctoral dissertation, the ritual function of ancient Egyptian mummy masks. And I believe this time we will hear more about the technical aspects of creating such masks and the operation of the workshops and reconstruction of the negotiation processes between craftsmen and customers in creating and preserving the identity of the deceased. So I will let Asja elaborate on this further. If you are ready, then you can share your screen, and we are ready to listen.
Thank you so much, and also for the invitation and the nice introduction.
Thank you for coming.
My work and life. And also, I really appreciate this format because I think that stimulates interdisciplinary and international cooperation a lot. So, and I hope I can at least add a bit to this as my today's presentation. So first, let me try to share that. So today, if you visit a museum with an Egyptian collection, whether in Europe or elsewhere, you can reasonably expect to see one or more Roman period mummy masks, Plaster specimen in particular. This is therefore reasonable to conclude that mummy masks constitute a widespread category of objects. When I published my dissertation on Roman period mummy masks of Egypt in 2021, I focused primarily on the changing status of these masks throughout their life cycle. That means their context of use. To this end, I identified 3 case stages. First, the production and sale. Second, activation prior to burial. And third, the cult of the dead. For my doctoral research, I created a schematic overview, you see it here, in the form of an ideal topological sequence. This shows the full range of possible actions for the Roman period. The funeral ritual began with a wake that lasted several days. During this time, the deceased stayed in the house so that relatives could pay their respects. The burial process itself presumably began at this point, which included the purchase or commissioning of a mummy mask, among other things. The second major phase comprises the activities carried out in the embalming hall. It is likely that the mask was placed on the mummy at this point. The third and final phase is represented by the burial itself. During this phase, the mummy and its mask were transported to the tomb, where they could subsequently be visited as part of the cult of the dead. During my doctoral studies, I focused primarily on stages 2 and 3, that means activation and tomb context. I only briefly touched upon the production process. However, the idea of studying the first stage has never completely left me, so I started another small research project as a follow-up of my PhD work, which I will present today. Before we turn to that, however, I will first give you a brief overview on the second and third stages of the mask's life cycle to provide you with this general background before tackling the production side. There is no architectural context to study from the second stage, since not a single embalming facility from the Roman period Egypt has yet been securely identified. However, to a certain extent, the appearance of the masks themselves can serve as a substitute. Mummy masks are always placed on the outermost layer of the mummy. By that point, the embalming and bandaging processes must already largely be complete. However, in some cases at least, it can be assumed that the placement of the mask was part of the bandaging process, as these masks have a slightly recessed ledge along the bottom edge over which the bandages are placed. You see that, for example, here and also there. Therefore, this must have occurred during the embalming ritual. This hypothesis aligns very well with several textual sources we cite at the end of the embalming process the day before the burial. As today's presentation has a different focus, I will not discuss these texts in great detail, but will highlight the most important observations arising from the comparison of Book of the Dead spell 151a, which was mainly used in the Ptolemaic period, and parts of the embalming ritual text, which was used from the late 1st to the early 2nd century AD. Both texts were probably recited at a point in time when the mask had already been applied to the mummy. Here, the focus is on the head of the masked being, which is attributed 3 characteristics: vision, beauty, and deification. These are also the characteristics displayed by the mask's iconographic appearance. Roman mummy masks demonstrate a variety of techniques for depicting the eyes, each aiming to achieve the most lifelike representation of visual capacity possible. You see it, for example, with these ones, made with labs, and that one also with metal eyelashes. And you see here ones that are inserted in the hands. The sign applies to beauty or the perfection of the body. Only a tiny number of mummy masks are known to me that may have been produced using molds taken directly from the face of the deceased, for example that one. If we compare this with the piece in the Bond collection, that one, which is typical of the vast majority of the genre, we see a clear difference. The skin is taut and smooth, often with lifelike coloring. The mouth is closed, and the eyes are usually large and wide open. Clearly, physiognomic features had to give way to the representation of a perfect body. That means a fully functional one. This raises the question of deification. Comparing Roman period and Ptolemaic mummy masks reveals that several elements were retained in the Roman period. For instance, this applies also to the combination of a tripartite wig and a broad wizard collar in male representations. You see it in the Ptolemaic example here, the wig and the collar. The wig on the Roman specimen here, and here the wig on the Roman specimen, and also the collar in between. These are elements of attire that were no longer worn in everyday life during the Roman period, but were associated with divine Egyptian iconography. Therefore, we can conclude that Roman period mummy masks appear to have retained all of the magical function that had already been attributed to them in the pre-Roman period, namely vision, beauty, and perfection, as well as deification. Once this magical activation had been completed, the masked mummy was placed in a tomb. Unlike in the second stage of the mummy mask life cycle, we must now rely almost entirely on archaeological evidence. The burial practices of masked mummies varied considerably depending on the region of Egypt. However, as I'm intending to focus on plaster masks today, I will discuss this aspect with regard to the necropolis of Tuna el-Gebel, which is the most important site for finding plaster specimen. I highlighted it here. As you can see on this map, the Tuna el-Gebel area is characterized by several settlements, extensive temple precinct, animal galleries, and a large necropolis. This is a settlement, and this is a settlement. Then we have here in green indicated a necropolis. There's a temple, and these are the galleries. The most significant tomb, TG 2006-G6, was discovered in 2004 and excavated in 2009 by a joint project between the universities of Cairo and Munich. It is located on the processional axis from Qom el-Loli to the temple of Osiris Baboon. So this is the processional axis here, and here we have the tombs, and this is the tomb I will talk about. This tomb was found undisturbed and contained many burials and objects, including one masked mummy. The structure is made of mud brick and is divided into 3 rooms. A large altar is located at the front, here, and the tomb was originally closed with a door. The individual rooms were decorated with garlands, you see it here, while the 3rd room at the back has a painted grapevine on its far wall, here. The excavators also found a striking triclinium-like bench arrangement here, as well as numbered sherds of eating and drinking vessels. You see the benches here and there. Burials primarily took place in the first 2 rooms. The mummies were placed on big built benches, wooden funerary beds, or the floor. So here, for example, benches, these ones on the floor, and this is a reconstruction of a similar kind of funerary bed as found in this tomb. Among these floor burials was the only masked female mummy. So you see it here. However, it can be assumed that this mummy was originally placed elsewhere, perhaps on one of the benches, as Melanie Flossmann-Schütze noted that it was broken in 2 when it was discovered. This may have occurred during relocation, given that the tomb was used repeatedly for burials over a long period from the 1st to the 3rd century AD. The mosque itself can be dated to the 2nd half of the 1st century or the 1st half of the 2nd century AD. This situation suggests several conclusions. Firstly, the altar in front of the tomb indicates that offerings were made as part of the burial ritual and funerary cult. The tomb rooms remained accessible, as evidenced by the hinged door that could be opened and closed. Furthermore, TG 2006 G6 is an unusual tomb in that it has its own banquet room. The large quantity of ceramic artifacts and the painted grapevine suggest that drinking and dining rituals must have been performed regularly. This demonstrates that ritual activities were conducted in close proximity to the deceased. It seems then that the mummies were both recipients of ritual offerings and participants in tomb banquets. In both cases, they were displayed as visibly as possible by being placed on benches or beds. Furthermore, the omission of coffins or sarcophagi points to a clear visual aspect of the mummies as well. Therefore, it is a logical question to ask what role the mummies played in the burial ritual and funerary cult within the context of the tomb. As I have already pointed out, Roman period mummy masks, unlike their predecessors, retain certain features of the divine appearance, such as the 3-parted wig and the Wesach color. And you see, this is normally how they are preserved. The Plaster specimen, this is a complete preserved one. By contrast, all other elements of their attire reflect real clothing habits, such as the Roman tunic with clavi, which is a decorative stripe on either side. You see the tunic here, and these are the clavi. This representational earthly appearance is probably why Roman period masked mummies were staged on beds and benches so that they could be seen, allowing the deceased this worldly identity to be acknowledged rather than hidden in underground passages or chambers. In fact, the masks were designed not only to be seen, but also to enable eye contact with the other ritual participants. As I noted earlier, great care was taken in depiction of the eyes. Their glossy surface makes them appear especially lifelike, and the transparent glass shims were deliberately tilted so that the masked mummy could return the gaze of the tomb visitor. This was deemed so important that over time it became accepted for there to be a spatial distance between the mummy's head and the mask. So just to show you, these are the tilted glass inlays. This is strikingly evident, so the distance between the mummy's head and the mask, in the progressive raising of the head from the horizontal chest panel over the centuries until it almost reached a 90-degree angle. You see it here, still very horizontally in the 1st century. This panel is missing, but you see, again, it is rising the head, and then this one is one of the highest elevations here. Thus, the higher the head was raised, the better the eye contact. In this way, the mummy masks enable the deceased to visually interact with the worthy participants in the burial and funerary ritual proceedings. So this is a specimen from Tuna-Aegyptiaca, and this is an old excavation photography. You see it here laying there, and you can imagine a two visitors standing there and looking into the eyes. Having discussed the activation of the mask in the embalming hole, as well as the subsequent hold of the dead in the tomb, we can now move on to the main part of today's presentation. We will examine the origin of all this, the production process in a mask workshop. As of the embalming hole, no workshop context has yet been identified. However, we can draw upon documentary texts and the appearance of the mummy masks themselves. According to documentary texts, which are usually written in Greek and primarily originate from the Fayum region, an appropriate burial required a large number of materials and services. The cost of these was charged to the commissioner, who was presumably the deceased family. This includes large quantities of oil as well as fabrics and wreaths. For example, payments for relevant services are also recorded, such as those of the embalmer, professional mourners, or transport of the mummy. Of particular interest, however, is the term prosopon or prosopedion. Previous scholarship has not hesitated to suggest that the object referred to as prosopon must be identical to a mummy mask, primarily because the Greek word prosopon was an ancient term for a theatre mask. However, the Greek term is much broader and simply means face. Therefore, I believe that it is not possible to assume a priori that all objects listed as prosopon in burial cost lists automatically correspond to what we today translate as mummy mask. Context and chronology are crucial here. Not only masks, but also facial images, the famous mummy portraits, existed in the Fayum in the 1st century AD. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, masks had ceased to exist in Harera, in Fayum at least, while with only mummy portraits being produced. The prosopon may therefore also refer to these. Here we may grasp an ancient collective term for types of objects that are distinguished in modern thought by being named masks and portraits. Yet to the ancient observer there may simply have been no substantial functional difference. However, any further insight into the production and commissioning of the mask can only be obtained by examining the masks themselves, which must begin with questions of provenance. As my mapping of material type shows, unlike cartonnage specimen, plaster masks are found almost exclusively in Middle Egypt, particularly around the two ancient necropolises of Tuna-Aegyptiaca and Antinopolis. Just to explain this to you, so the blue ones are the plaster masks, and everything that is red is made of cartonnage. One or more workshop groups were evidently active here in the Middle Egyptian region, producing mummy masks from at least the Claudian period, that means the first half of the 1st century AD, until around 250 AD. Apparently these masks were occasionally traded further north to nearby locations or bought or bay in small quantities. So you see these ones, they are very, very small quantities, but they are. Plaster masks account for the largest proportion of Roman period mummy masks by far, so those ones. Followed at a considerable distance by cartonnage masks, here, and the other material types in negligible quantities. At first glance, this may seem surprising, given that the distribution area is much smaller than the one of the cartonnage mask. One reason for this is the manufacturing process, to which we now will take a look. At some point around the turn of the era, craftsmen based in Middle Egypt must have invented a completely new technique for producing mummy masks. This technique involved a different material, plaster, and a different type of modeling, moulds. These were independently modeled facial forms not cast from the faces of the deceased. However, I should state at the outset that none of these molds has yet been discovered, because we're lacking the workshops. This inference is based on the appearance on the masks only. After a brief drying period, the plaster layer was removed from the mold and remodeled with the help of another thin layer of plaster. Only then were other elements added, such as clothing, jewellery, attributes, and of course the chest and side panels, as well as the ritual scenes painted on them. And you see it here quite well, so everything that has A different appearance is added separately later on. Only the white part here is the face mold, and the same applies to the panels fixed to this head part. This heavily revised process results in a rich spectrum of variation, making it very difficult to visually determine from photography which pieces were produced using the same facial mold. This is an image from my own database, and I can guess that that one, for example, and that one belong to the same mold, but it's difficult to prove that, also for these ones, for example. During my doctoral studies, I was so occupied with examining that 1,789 Roman period specimen that I ultimately decided not to compile a systematic record of the mold series. Nevertheless, I could not entirely let go of the idea, as I was well aware that there was considerably heuristic potential here, if only a way could be found to approach the problem on an empirically robust basis, so to make sure that they belong to the same face mold line. During my work on several excavation projects, I discovered photogrammetry, digital 3D modeling using the Microsoft Metashape program. I therefore applied this method on a few collections in order to see if this might be the solution I was searching for. The first test case I undertook was at the Museum of Egyptian Art in Munich. This decision was partially motivated by practical considerations, as I was traveling to Munich to give a presentation anyway. Furthermore, the Munich collection had a significant advantage in that it included two objects that I suspected had been produced on the same mold. You see them here, but not on the same shelf. So it's difficult to compare them when they're exhibited like that. This meant that I only need to photograph one collection to test my method for assembling mold lines. As you can see here, the result was a complete success. This approach allowed me to compare not just contours, but the entire facial geometry by superimposing two digital models. I was also able to scale both models, ensuring consistent size ratios. Therefore, if the dimensions and shape correspond more or less exactly, it seems highly plausible to speak of a common mold series, as you see in this case. The situation is very similar with regard to provenance research. As I mentioned previously, the group of plaster masks was confined to the Middle Egyptian region, and the objects in question were primarily found in the area surrounding the necropolises of Tuna-el-Gebel and Antinopolis. However, at the time of my doctoral research, it was not possible to differentiate this large mass of objects into individual workshops. I therefore termed the two main clusters of objects as Tuna-el-Gebel Antinopolis workshops 1 and 2. You see specimens from both groups here. And these are completely preserved, just to mention. Naturally, one would like to be more precise now. How many workshops were active at a given time? How far did these workshops distribute their products? Were there any periodic fluctuations? That means, did certain workshops produce more objects at a particular point in time than others? So, were they did they have more success? And did they exchange ideas or even molds? In theory, stylistic features could be used for this purpose. For instance, the manner in which elements of the decorative program are drawn could be considered. This seems to be the case, for instance, with two plaster masks and one in Cairo. So I looked on very, very much of these ringed sandust, only to discover that this is, in case of style, they are very, very near to each other, these ones. Furthermore, the two pieces appear sufficiently similar from the front as well to suggest that they were produced using the same mold. The Cairo piece certainly originates from Tuna-el-Gebel. Given that the bun mask was acquired for the art market, as usual, it is highly probable that it also originates from the same workshop. However, such stylistic comparisons are not feasible for the majority of plaster masks, since the decorative program is largely lost in most cases. For a quantitative perspective, mold series therefore offer greater promise once again. This can be demonstrated by using masks from Tübingen and Paris. For example, I suspected the tubing mast was made using the same mold as the mast in the Louvre, which was found on Tuner-Ägyptiaca. See this when looking at the images. A similar situation may apply to another tubing mast. A potentially identical mold was found in Tuner-Ägyptiaca. However, in this case, the nasal area, this one, is largely missing, meaning that a purely visual comparison of photographs is insufficient to establish this connection. Digital models would be required. I therefore hope that one day I will have the chance to go to Louvre and take these 3D photographs in order to prove my hypothesis. As you can see, the heuristic potential is enormous, but it relies on substantial SFM model datasets. And this is precisely what I currently lack. Although I am unable to work continuously on expanding my material base owing to other commitments, I take advantage on every opportunity that presents itself. And such opportunities arise during lecture tours, for example. I have therefore documented the collections, not only these 4, but ones in Berlin, Basel, Bonn, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Munich, and Tübingen, as well as smaller collections in Copenhagen and Paris. Progress is therefore being made, albeit gradual. However, investigations of mold series based on structure from motion method are not only of interest for basic research into questions of provenance, but also hold considerably heuristic potential for one of my favorite research areas. A practice-based approach to mass, particularly on the negotiation processes involving individualization strategies within the workshop. In my doctoral work, I identified 4 methods of individualization. First, placing the mask on a specific mummy. Second, adding a name inscription to the mask or the mummy. Third, portrait features. And fourth, visual differentiation. I will therefore now discuss the first 3 briefly before focusing on the last, visual differentiation. The process of individualization through mask application involves bringing the mask and body together within the embalming hall. We have discussed this already. Another strategy is to individualize the mask and mummy by writing a name on it. We have only these 3 pieces, so for the plaster mask, but I think this is probably because the rear part of the mask, where there's the inscription, is an error that has rarely survived, so I imagine there were more. Next, as Walter Kuperi has demonstrated, multiple objects, for example, masks made from molds, including plaster masks, exist within 2 systems of reference. The first is the vertical relationship between a mask and its prototype, which encompasses portrait features, and the second is the horizontal relationship, which involves differentiation, for example, pieces using the same mold. In the field of mummy portraits, generation of scholars have attempted to demonstrate physiognomic similarities between the painted portrait and the person believed to be its subject. We see attempts in this regard here. This assumption is highly controversial and is evidently rooted in the idea that the portrait may reveal the ancient persons as they really were. Regarding the mummy masks, this idea was only discussed in relation to a small group of objects with distinctly different facial features, such as slack facial muscles, a strongly pronounced bone structure, life-sized eyes, or signs of aging. This suggests that a cast may have been taken from a body after death. The existence of such casting techniques is attested by a cast from Tuner-Ägyptiaca. So this one was found. This is not a mummy mask. This is a cast that they detected there. However, regarding a genre in total, it would be absurd to assume that a masker mask produced alongside countless others from the same mold could represent the physiognomic portraits of a specific individual. So that means all the others, not only these 7 pieces. This therefore leads us away from the vertical relationship between the deceased and the mask towards the horizontal relationship, which I have termed individualization by visual differentiation. In my PhD research, this term primarily refers to the iconographic appearance. That means elements such as dress, hair arrangement, body posture, and decorative program, rather than the modeling of the body itself. However, if one were to systematically combine and analyze mold series, a number of questions would arise that touch upon this point. And these are the questions. Firstly, how was distinguishability created within a mold series? Was it achieved solely through iconographic means, or was remodeling of facial features also involved after the plaster casts had been removed from the mold? Secondly, was only one mold used at a time, or did workshops have several facial forms in their range? Were there separate molds for women and men, as well as for adults and children? Thirdly, how do mold series behave from a diachronic perspective? Does the production spectrum narrow with individual molds become standardized, does it become increasingly differentiated? How do facial molds change over time? For example, do they return to the so-called zeitgeist, the period phase? Lastly, what roles did clients play in shaping the appearance of an individual mask, and what role did craftsmen play? Ultimately, was it largely irrelevant which mold was used and what the finished product looked like, since physiognomic resemblance to the wearer was not to be expected anyway? As I mentioned earlier, I'm still in the early stages of my systematic investigation of mold series. I am therefore not able to answer most of these questions. They represent more of a research program than actual research results. Nevertheless, in my the final section of my paper, I would like to share some initial thoughts on questions 1, 3, and 5 of this research program, based on my, at the moment, admittedly limited material. Regarding questions 2 and 4, I refrain from offering any prognosis until I have a sufficient quantitative databases. So, regarding question 1, the remodeling of mummy masks after removal from the mold, I can confirm this was indeed the case to a certain extent. This is demonstrated by the two pieces in Munich, for example. Deviations occur, you see it here, in the nasal region. So far, these modifications to the basic form remained within a relatively narrow range. There were no excessively protruding noses, to put it somewhat flippantly. However, if we consider the total number of possible specimens within a single mold series, a greater degree of variation becomes apparent. For example, consider the Windsor piece over here. That's a problem with the window. Okay, no. You see this nose, which is much more broad. So I have to check if I have a model, I can compare and see if this is the same mold, and then that means substantial remodeling in this case. Okay. This raises the question of whether such remodeling might have arisen from a desire to make the mask more physiognomically similar to its prototype, the deceased. However, other experimental models must also be considered, such as remodeling as an additional means of visual differentiation or as an approximation to a desired body or role model. This could include fuller lips, for example, connoting sexual appeal, more sharply contoured supraorbital ridges connoting masculinity, and signs of aging connoting life experience. Furthermore, a comparison of the two unique masks already shows that the same facial form could be used for both men and women. Individualization therefore focused on gender rather than biological sex, if one can speak of this at all based on a facial form alone. This raises the question of whether this was always the case or only in the 1st century AD, as this is the period to which the two masks belong. Other possible pairings that I have considered also date to the 1st century AD. Is this a mere coincidence? Or were sexually differentiated facial molds developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD? If so, what might this tell us about changing conceptions of the body? These questions will have to be examined on the basis of a larger corpus of material. The final research question I will address is, in my opinion, the most interesting, however. It concerns the negotiation processes between craftsmen and commissioners, who decided whether to use a generic facial mold or take a cast from the face of the deceased. To what extent was the personalized appearance of the mask created using a mold the result of negotiations between client and workshop staff? Was the mask simply selected from those already finished and on offer? When exactly was the name tied to the mask, thus fixing its assignment to specific deceased individuals, or at least their family? These questions cannot be answered by either the spatial context of mask workshops or literary context of transmitted written sources. This rather disillusioning statement will still represent my current level of knowledge if I had not encountered an inscription in an unexpected place in Bonn by chance. This had far-reaching consequences for previous hypotheses concerning workshop processes. The inscription in question is a word written in black ink on the inside of a right cheek. You see, this is the frontal part, there's the inner part, and you just see it here. Although designs themselves are very well preserved, the writing must clearly be done rather hastily. Accordingly, decipherment is difficult. What can be said with certainty is that the word ends at the left margin with a hook shaped divine determinative accompanied by a filler stroke. So you see it here and there. Based on this sign, the inscription must therefore have been written in hieratic, demotic, or a combination of the two. As the text refers to a deity, there are three possible interpretations. First, a divine name. Second, a personal name incorporating a divine element. Or, third, a so-called pseudo-inscription. Ultimately, I have concluded that we are most likely dealing with a terraphoric personal name, potentially, but only potentially, when never an epithet of Osiris. However, for today's presentation, the Bonn inscription is more interesting in terms of the context of its application than in its specific content. The question arises as to why a personal name should have been applied in such a largely concealed location, or at least one that was not permanently visible. There are, however, a few comparable cases of such a practice. For instance, a Ptolemaic cartonnage mask in Munich bears the name Sokolopis on the inside. So you see it here, and it would sit on the other side here. Furthermore, Petrie previously observed similar Greek name inscriptions on the inside of Ptolemaic and Roman period mummy masks from Havela. You see these ones here, but it's not clear if they refer to these ones or other specimens. We simply don't know. Last but not least, in Berlin, I detected another Roman period plaster specimen whose interior displays the Greek name on Ainaros. So this is the front, and then you see the inscription here. A couple of minutes ago, I explained that the transmission of the personal name, that is, the process of identifying an individual by means of a name inscription, was normally ensured by labeling the exterior of the mask. So, for example, here. This location remained visible even after the mask had been placed on the mummy. So why should a name also be written on the inside? Petrie suggested that such interior name inscriptions were makers' memoranda or workshop notes is the most convincing explanation. This practice is by no means uncommon in other types of serial production, such as terracottas. It seems that inscriptions of this type primarily serve to temporarily assign a commissioned object to its commissioner. In contrast to the outward-facing names, those on the interior were likely only relevant for the duration of the production and selling process, hence their cursory execution. However, an important difference between Ptolemaic and Roman cartonnage mask and plaster specimen lies in the exact location of the inscription. In case of the cartonnage mask, the inscription is on the inside of the chest panel. This is still a place that could be accessed after the mask was assembled. But this was not the case with the plaster mask in Bonn and Berlin. So you have to imagine this one looking more or less in its assembled state like that one, and the inscription would be on the other side of this area. This is simply not possible to access it. This observation allows us to draw the highly interesting inference that there was regularly, or perhaps even routinely, a time interval between ordering an object and collecting it, since otherwise the inscription of the name would not have been necessary. And this has significant implications for our understanding of workshop procedures. The inscription must have been applied at the point when only the face had been removed from the mold to serve as the mask basis component, before it was assembled with other components. Otherwise, this location would have been inaccessible for writing. This contradicts previous hypotheses about how such workshop procedures functioned. When Günther Grimm wrote his influential book on Imperial period Egyptian mummy masks in 1974, he was not particularly interested in workshop processes. Nevertheless, he did hypothesize about a topic that is highly relevant in this context, the issue of the so-called workshop pieces. This is how he called them. By this apparently meant mummy masks that have been fully completed, but have not initially been sold, what would we call workshop soil stock or slow movers today, and which only reached the market much later. Admittedly, the storage of almost complete mummy masks, maybe excluding the painting, which was also intended to bear the deceased name on the outside, would be conceivable in exceptional cases. For instance, this could apply if a previously commissioned piece had not been collected. However, this is certainly not plausible on a larger scale. The material and manufacturing technique make plaster masks rather fragile in their fully assembled state and not particularly suitable for long-term storage. You have seen lots of pieces where only the head remains, and this is, of course, due to the fragility of the material and the technique. It is much more likely, therefore, that they were produced ad hoc to order. If the personal name on the mask is indeed the workshop note, either the name of the commissioner or the deceased, we must assume that the commissioner exercised influence over the mask's appearance at that early stage in the manufacturing process, when selecting one of the facial models. This implies that his starting point for individualization through visual differentiation was anything but insignificant to the commissioner. So it's not like they went there and just selected something that has already been assembled, because they all look the same. Purely speculatively, the process may have worked as follows. The commissioners entered the workshop where they were shown several facial models and plaster face casts that had already been removed from the mold. One of these was selected, and the name inscription was applied to the inner face of the resulting cast. This was perhaps done to prevent any risk of confusion when processing several orders simultaneously, and also to serve as a mnemonic aid when applying the deceased name to the exterior of the finished mask later on. Only then was the manufacturing process completed, with the mask being fully assembled and painted before being handed over to the commissioner. The result was that different outward appearances were achieved using the same model depending on the client's wishes. And with this, I will now conclude my presentation with a brief statement about individualization as a process that permeates all three stages of the mask's life cycle. If the mask was commissioned and customized in the workshop already as I proposed, then the embalming hall and the tomb primarily represent a spatial context in which the final acts of individualization took place. Thus, the application of the mask and the integration of the masked mummy into the burial assemblage. From this perspective, the customization of the mask was not primarily about representing an individual's unique physical features, but about enabling the deceased to establish a distinguishable and recognizable personal identity within the funerary community. While the facial structure essentially remained the same, we have seen that, one could argue indeed that these workshops produced individuals in series. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation and look forward to the discussion. And I will close my presentation maybe so that I can see people.
Okay, thank you very much, Asja, for this really fascinating and rich presentation and bringing us really eye to eye with these masks. So yeah, we are opening the floor for discussion. You can either just use the raise hand feature of Zoom and ask your question in person. And yeah, we didn't have to wait for long. So Nicholas, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Müller. This was really interesting. As someone who studies funerary ritual in Roman Phoenicia, I could really appreciate the ritual approach and how you incorporated the making process as well. I found it really interesting that you traced the elevation of the head over time, so it becomes more elevated. It has more agency, especially with the open eyes in Egypt. So, really interacting with the living. And I was wondering if this elevation in later periods is merely like an artificial representation of a portrait substitute or index, or if it's mirroring the treatment of the corpse within the coffins. Do you have archaeological evidence or artistic representations that show that the head was very elevated on a pillow or something like that?
Not the corpse itself. What we have are mummies from earlier periods that are, seems like, found in the Fayum region within, I can say this in English, a shelf. Let me check for a second the word. A cupboard? I think it's a cupboard. So we just put them upright and put the mummy inside, and then you can close and open the doors. So that one is obviously meant to stand as it is, and then the elevation is not there of the
Okay.
mummy's body.
Okay.
I have no pieces showing. Oh, no, that's not true. I have pieces of the decorative program on the neck of the masked mummies where there's an elevation shown. But I have no indications of cushion. So what we see there is basically a mummy with the mask whose head is elevated. So what we have there. I don't think that this regards to propping up the head of real mummies or real corpses doing, don't know, for example, the wake or something like that. But it's maybe a charted change of how they were presented within the tombs. This is more what I would say is correct. Seems like the earlier ones are laying on the ground and staring just at the top of the in the sky, or the top of the tomb. And later on, seems like it's like they were propped up, and then the head is raised, and the eyes are all the eye inlays are also tilted, so to make a better communication. So my hypothesis was indeed, doing my PhD work, that mummy masks have assembled the functions of a portrait and of a mummy, so representative functions and magical functions in one. Because there's a difference with regard to the earlier phases where the mummies were put in coffins and sealed underground, so nobody would see them. So they just gained something. They gained a representational function. So that would be my explanation.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Is it possible that maybe the elevation has something to do with the earlier headrests, like an afterthought of that practice?
I mean, nobody thought about this theory, but there is an idea about the elevation of the head referring to the rising of Osiris. And have indeed images that show exactly that. So I don't think that is something that contradicts each other. They can be more like interacting with the living tomb visitors, and at the same time, the idea of Osiris rising is also at stake. But I don't have any indications of propping up the head of the mummies themselves, because it's simply not necessary. If you have the mummy, it is already elevated. And sees this looking at you. So
okay, I see. Thank you. Do we have any more questions? You can also type your questions in the chat and we can read it out for you if you feel more comfortable. Yep. Let's see what we have. Many thanks for the fantastic presentation. I'm aware that what I am going to ask may come too early in your research for you to answer. Anyway, did you happen to notice if the same phenomenon of individuals serially produced applies also to mummy portrait production?
So this is something that has been heavily discussed in research and is still discussed. There are two groups that would stand against each other concerning their ideas. The one says mummy portraits are painted in life to resemble individuals, portraits in a Renaissance sense. So somebody is sitting there and somebody else is going to draw them. This is one of the ideas. The other one says we have very little indication that mummy portraits have been painted live. They were rather painted in death, but not by the dead person. But they had like a scheme, it's not the same like using mold, but like a sketch or an idea on a general appearance of, for example, middle-aged women. And then they made it to resemble an individual without exactly referring to the dead person itself. And I have to admit, looking at the material discussion, although this is not my principal area of study, I believe more of the second option. So I don't think that these mummy portraits really did resemble the dead that were in these portraits, because otherwise there are some that resemble each other quite a lot. We would then have to say, okay, this is because they're all siblings. I don't believe that. I would say, okay, it may be possible that some of them have started as life like portraits, but this doesn't account for all of them. I don't believe that. But this is an ongoing discussion in research which has not been resolved until now.
Maybe we also have another question in the chat from Wojciech. Thank you for such a fascinating talk. It is interesting that the same term prosopon was used of both the mummy mask and Greek theater mask. Do we have any indication as to whether these two types of masks were thought of as similar by the Greeks in Egypt?
Okay. We have no, as far as I know, no discussion about linking mummy masks and the Greek theater mask. We can only have a look onto how the term was used in Greece, and there they used it, for example, but not only for this, for Greek theater masks. Yeah, and we are to name them masks. Yeah. And then we can look how the term prosopon was used in Egypt. And in Egypt, I have quite some references in funerary documents, as I showed to you. So that is clear that these are not theater masks. It's relatively clear from the context of the text and what was written there. So they must apply to something that has a relation to the death phase. So in fact, the term just says face. And also there's the Egyptian term hair or tep. And this means also face or head. So I don't think it's a coincidence. So I don't think that when they termed it prosopon, they have naturally thought about theater masks, especially as theater masks are different than mummy masks. Normally, theater masks are not thought to have a magical function, and also these were worn by living people with the eyes, it's called the holes for the eyes to look them through. While mummy masks are set on the mummy to raise it to life, and they look through the eyes of the mask, but not through holes inside the mask. So I think it's a different concept in this regard.
Okay, let's see the next question. Thank you, Asja. Thanks
Sorry,
very much.
Just to add, also
Okay.
there's a discussion, why don't we have a term for mummy portrait? We couldn't recognize one. People would think they must be termed icon, so painted likeness. But we don't have any indication for that. And I would say that is probably because they were also called prosopon, only because we think that prosopon means something like a Greek mask or whatever we would call a mask. I don't think that the ancient thought the same. So
Okay. Thank you. You drew importance of the importance of the eyes of the mummy masks. What do you think was the fuller purpose of magnifying the feature?
Okay, I think the complete purpose was make them view, and then through this viewing, and this is quite quite easy to grasp within the text, viewing means life. So that means the more pronounced the eyes and the more lifelike, the more living is the person wearing the mask. So that would be my explanation for that. That importance of viewing, because viewing is living. This is quite clear from the ancient Egyptian texts.
That's interesting. Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Well, while you are thinking, I have a small technical question which was not clear to me before, and it just got me thinking that on one of your last slides, which we can see there, I have the impression that the mold is really just the face. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean,
So
the one.
everything else was applied afterwards.
Yeah, okay. We have to differentiate a bit with this regard. Um, what normally is preserved is the head only. I showed you lots of head pieces where all the other parts are missing. And in the heads, normally the only thing that is made with a mold is the face, indeed. There are like 2 or 4 pieces where they also seems to have taken the hair out of the mold, but this is really rare. So not only in the earlier stages, like first century, and not afterwards. Everything else is added separately, which makes it so difficult to just look at pictures and then say, or photographs, and say, okay, these are from the same molds, because photographs also are from different angles, black and white, making pieces look very different. But when one examines the completely preserved piece, for example, this box-like types of the chest panels and the side panels, we can, I think, see that sometimes also hands, for example, are made by using molds. The problem is still, I don't have enough of these pieces to compare these ones as well. So it's better to go for the face molds, which are much more preserved than for hands, for example.
Okay. I see, thank you. Because I was really surprised by the one, I believe it was a piece from Tübingen, which was bald.
Which was what?
It was bald, no hair.
Yeah.
So that was,
yeah, sometimes that goes, I mean, that's the problem. So you can assemble them, like the Lego, for example, but they don't stick very well together. The faster you produce them when they're still a bit wet, the better it sticks there. But I have quite some pieces where the hair is just simply lost. There are like 3 or 4 pieces where we can be sure that there was never hair, so they were depicted as bald. But this is not the case for the other 99% of the pieces. So yeah.
And where we can say that it was originally bald, and can we make an assumption that was maybe a priest, and then so that's another individualizing feature, right?
So it seems like the priest as a role model, like unlike the more generic, like I am a woman of high status or man of high status, is rare, but it is existing. So I can be sure that these were definitely bald, because you can see like very tiny indications of cropped hair painted on the top. So then in this case, it's not because the hair is simply lost, but it was made like that. But also in this case, we don't have indications of profession painted on top of them. So we cannot be completely sure that they were priests. But I have pieces, women in particular, where it is clear that the women were in possession of priesthoods. And they have another type, of course, they're not bald. But yeah, so that would be the idea, that the bald ones are indeed priests, but we cannot prove it without the inscriptions. It's again only the face, the heads and faces.
Yeah, it's never that simple.
Okay. Unfortunately.
Yeah, a question from Emma. Thank you for a wonderful talk. May I ask if there's been any analysis of the plaster and pigments, if there are any, in regards to the origin of the base materials?
So yes, it is. There are a couple of collections which have been analyzed. The only problems that we're lacking the comparative materials. So, for example, they did analysis of a collection in, I think it was the UCL in London, I don't remember properly, and for example in Paris in the Louvre, and we have lots of indications about the exact material that has been used to produce the plaster. But we are lacking the sources from Egypt, so the gypsum from any area. I know that there were such gypsum quarries, but as far as I know, nobody went there to analyze the gypsum from there and then compare it to the results from the other collections. I wish that would have been done. The only piece I know where something like this has been done, I think, is a cartonnage piece in Baltimore, I think, where they analyzed the thin gypsum layer on top of the cartonnage. And there they found out that this resembles material in the Fayum region. And this was also from the iconographic analysis where we thought that the piece must have originated. But this is the only case I know where they did this. I wish there would be more. And I cannot do it, unfortunately, because I don't have like the material or the technique at hand to do that. And also you have to go to Egypt to get a permission to do that first.
Okay, thank you. Peter, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. Yeah, I just have a question which is probably very naive, but looking at these objects, the closest sort of iconographical parallel that immediately springs to my mind is classical and Hellenistic terracotta heads, and in Greek art, and I wonder. They do seem to be very, very classical images somehow. And particularly, when I compare them with the very Egyptian qualities of the cartonnage masks from the Fayum and so on, I'm wondering, and also taking into account what you told us about the localization of these objects in Tumal Gebel. I was wondering, whether you could whether this implies anything about the people who are commissioning and using these
Okay.
objects.
Okay, these are very difficult questions that all relate to each other. You are right in a way that the style of the plaster specimen is looking to us Hellenistic Roman somehow in style. But then we would also account for the Ptolemaic period where they had already lots of sculpture produced. And also some of the features, for example, these huge eyes are not Hellenistic at all, or not Hellenistic Roman at all. So there's still something in there. I did not show so many of the Fayum cartonnage masks, but if you look closely on them, you find out that they have the same style like the plaster piece. They are just more flat because they are made by using a core probably, and then they press the cartonnage on it, and probably also a mold from the outside. So that's the difference between them. But iconographically speaking, there's not much difference in between these cases. And there has been a huge discussion in research as this stylistically, only stylistically, more Hellenistic Roman appearance of the mummy masks of Roman period indicates that are less Osiris or less Egyptian or less gods. And I would say no, because what we have is, for example, divine attire, leopards and colors. And also, I haven't shown this because it was not the focus of my presentation. Lots of Egyptian scenes around the head, like Egyptian gods offering to Osiris, and also the deceased in between. And this is all extremely Egyptian. So I don't see a contradiction between using a different style, adding a representation that is more like fashionable, maybe, And the idea is still Osiris, or the deceased that it has been divinized. So that was the argumentation in my PhD work, I have to say. So I don't believe in that. I think they just added another function, a representation function, and for this they used strategies that has been around in the Mediterranean since several hundred years already, from the Ptolemaic period onwards at the latest. But this doesn't mean that the mummy must lose something of the magical function they had already since thousands of years, since the Old Kingdom. So does this answer your question, more or less?
Yes, thank you, thank you. I'm really grateful. And I suppose, you talk so beautifully about the eyes as a kind of way of enlivening the mask and maintaining the life in the body. So clearly we're pointing back at that tradition. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question about choice. How was the choice made between having a mask and a portrait for a given mummy?
So this is again a question that has been discussed since like 100 years in research and has not been answered. I cannot answer this either. So I can only point to the fact that there are tombs where mummy masks and mummy portraits seems like have been used by the same family. So that must have been not something about availability, at least in the Fayoum region. It's different in Tuna Gebel, where there was seems like no mummy portrait workshop, but in the Fayoum region, both of these options and others, there are more. Yeah? Not only masks and portraits are available. And then that must have been a personal choice. I don't believe that, for example, the mummy masks were much cheaper than a painted portrait because they were painted also. So it's we just only by using, for example, moulds, you can speed up the process, and then it's easier to produce such a big amount of pieces, but still you have to do the inlays, you still have to do the gilding of the faces, which is also often the case, and also the painting. So I don't think it's an economic choice. It seems like more like a personal choice. And then we can ask, what is the difference between a mummy portrait and a mummy mask? I would say, in regard of the magical function, there's no difference. Both of them are able to revive the deceased, to give it a face, to interact with the living persons entering the tombs. There might be a difference in terms of how presence is created within the tomb. So more like giving the deceased a fully formed body by plaster masks, for example, or more of presenting him or her in an illusionistic way by tilting the head, giving shadow, painting a lifelike experience. So that might be a difference between the two. But then again, we cannot say like only people of Greek descent would commission a mummy portrait, and the ones of Egyptian descent would commission a mummy mask. This doesn't work at all in the Fayoum region, which there people have a strong Greek background, I would say, and they have both. Or, for example, in Tuna El Gebel, where this is probably the burial ground mainly for the big city of Hermopolis Magna. And, for example, in terms of administration, all people living in Hermopolis Magna must have been termed Egyptians. And all people living at a nearby city of Antinopolis were termed Greeks or Romans, depending on the citizen right. So, and both of them use portraits and masks. So it doesn't work like that. We cannot say by choosing a mask which ethnic background the person has. So I don't think it works like that, and we have to refrain from this idea. If this was the case, if this was the question.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else you would like to ask Asja Müller? Well, if not, then I would really like to thank you for this wonderful paper.
Mhm.
And thank you for accepting our invitation. And we will reconvene in a month's time. I believe we will stay in the funerary sphere and hear a lecture about funerary stele from Terenutis, from Silvandanin. So I hope many of you can join us again then. Thank you again, Asja, for coming and giving us this talk.
Thank you for the invitation and a nice discussion.
Thank you. See you next month.